Well, it's great to have you on, Will.
Thanks for having me.
Will and I have known each other for probably
12, 13
12
years?
Yeah. Yeah, we were in the core at BYU together.
Mm-hmm.
We later ended up at business school together.
Yeah.
We both had an interest in Africa. I had spent a few years there, and Will grew up there, and so we were in the Africa Business Club at business school together. And now,
Here we are in Utah together.
yeah, so we're back together. We're really excited to talk. Today, really want to focus on Will's story. I think you'll find it fascinating as you hear the grit and resiliency and the path that he took to get here. And one of the snippets is Will came to the U.S. with $300.
My mother says it's 600. I know it was 300.
Yeah.
But sure.
So there's a little teaser, and Will has spent time at the likes of Warburg Pincus, Goldman Sachs, doing a startup, lived in New York, Utah, Gabon, so he's had a much more interesting life than I have, for sure, so that's why I like interviewing him. But I'll just introduce myself real quick. So my name's Tanner. I'm a partner at Kickstart. We do early stage pre-seed and seed investing in Utah. I've been doing that since 2008, and we try to invest in we see as the best of the Mountain West. And so Will is somebody that we backed in 2020 when he moved back from New York to Utah with COVID. So maybe we'll do the introduction with you as we go along, but maybe let's start, where are you from? And let's start with the story of how you ended up in America.
So originally from Libreville, which is the capital of Gabon, a country in Central West Africa, so right by the Congo, Cameroon, Angola. Grew up and really loved chemistry, biology, so did a baccalaureate in chemistry biology, but I also skipped a bunch of grades. And so by the time I did my baccalaureate, normally you're 18, 19, I was 15. And so the good thing is I was done early. The bad thing is most people from my country go to France. It's a French-speaking country, so they go to France. Most of my siblings went there. And usually, university in France is 600 euros, and back then 300. And then usually you get some scholarship from the government of Gabon if you have good enough grades, and that is able to pay for everything. But when you're 15, 16, you can't go to university in France because you're not 18 and whatnot, unless you're living with a host family and so forth. And so the U.S. happened to be kind of the one country where the moment I turned 16, I could show up here and just go to school and do things. And so we made the decision. It still took a little while, almost a year from the time I graduated to the time I could come here for college, but I was still 16, so came here and started. I didn't speak English, actually, so I had to learn English, which I only did a month in Kentucky, and then went to community college in Texas, and that's where I learned English. So my English used to sound like something between Kentucky and Texas and Gabon, which was very funky sounding, but that's where I learned.
So maybe walk us through that moment when you get to Texas, you don't know anybody in the world, you're not speaking the language. What was 16-year-old Will's mind like? Because I know my mind at 16, and I didn't have any depth.
Yeah,
no depth like that.
No, I feel like it's maybe only because I was 16, right? I just feel like if I had done that when I was 25, I probably would have been freaking out, right? And so I think because I was 16, it was kind of like, oh, this is cool. I'm in America, and you just do this stuff. And so, so I was in Kentucky. When I first came in, I thought, hey, at least in my country, graduated early and all that, I thought, hey, I'm going to apply to all these universities, and of course they're going to let me in, right? Because I'm Wil Eyi, of course they're going to let me in. Only to realize, no, it's December. You can't apply to college in December, and you're going to have to stay another 6 months and then apply for next year. And by the way, you have to take the SAT, ACT, and I'm just like, I have no idea what any of this means. But community colleges in Texas, you just take this entrance exam, and then they let you stay there and learn English and everything. And so a few of us from Africa just took a Greyhound bus from Louisville, Kentucky, down to Sherman, Denison, Texas, which is where Grayson County College is. And we decided, let's just take the entrance exam. About half of us passed it, the other half didn't. And with that, then I could start taking English classes at the community college, which is $2,000 a semester a lot better than $1,000 a month at the language program. And so the thought was, hey, this basically just gave me an extension to stay in the U.S. 6 more months because I just passed this test, and great, now I'm here for another 6 months. So that really was the only thought I had.
Yeah, that's wild. So you're Louisville, Texas, and I know it's a really common path for people to go from Gabon to Louisville, Texas, and then to BYU. So maybe tell us about the path.
Yeah, no, that was definitely so. Finally, learned English in Texas. As I said, I love biology, chemistry, and in community college, because I didn't speak English at first, I took a bunch of biology and chemistry classes because you don't need to speak English that well. If you know the science, then you could just take it and have straight A's and not worry about it too much. And so I ended up getting 2 associates, one in biology, one in chemistry, because I just loaded up a bunch of classes. And then, we're in Utah, so I can say this. Of course, I met people from the LDS Church, and they were like, "Hey, this, and that," and they kept telling me about BYU, and I'm like, "No, I don't like. I need a college that basically costs $2,000. That's all I can afford." And they're like, "Well,
What do we have something for you?"
Yeah,
buddy?
exactly. You're in great luck. We actually know one of those." And so I was like, "Oh wow, it's amazing." Yeah, because I was working. I was working to pay for college, and so I needed a place where I could work and do college full time and be able to afford college. Of course, I then learned about scholarships, and I got a few of those at BYU, so that was nice. But so that's the path. When I was in Sherman, north of Dallas, met folks from the LDS Church, and that's what routed me to BYU.
It's amazing. So you're here. What year is that?
So at this point, it's 2006, and so I've just turned 18 at this point, and I am making my way to BYU. That's right.
Okay, so you're here at 18. Maybe talk to us, like, if people here are Silicon Slopes interested in the place, like, what was it like? What were your impressions?
Honestly, it was, the mountains, actually, I have to say, to this day, I actually do live up here in Lehigh on one of these mountains, and I still look out of my house or whatever, and I'm just like, wow, I can't believe this is real. Like, it still feels like it's not real. So the mountains was absolutely incredible. But then, of course, because when I was in Texas, I spent a lot of time with Africans, and then I came to BYU, and it was the first time in my life where I looked around and I was like, okay, I obviously look very different than everyone around me. And I don't think I'd ever felt that. And I don't think I even had ever processed that. So just to be in a place where you look around and you feel like, okay, absolutely no one looks like me. Of course, then I found the Black Student Union, which I ended up becoming president of, because that was kind of the one refuge. It's like, oh wow, hey, I found one room where a lot of people look like me, and so that was definitely a big impression. But outside of that, no, I should say, I came in and then left for a couple of years for an LDS mission, and then came back, and so the first little bit, I was just more focused on what am I even doing? How do I figure this out? And then when I came back, I was super focused on figuring out what I was going to do with my life, because I had done, at this point, 3.5 years of biochemistry. I had taken all the classes from med school. I was going to do the MCAT, and then I learned about this thing called finance. And of course, I want to graduate, but I also want to make sure I'm doing the right thing. And so I think I was so focused on that. Plus, I had my crew from the Black Student Union that it ended up working out pretty well for me.
Okay, so we're at this decision point. You're on your path to become a MD, PhD in biochemistry, and then finance comes knocking. Like, what about that was so appealing to you?
This is going to sound foreign to most people, but I grew up in a country that was both my parents worked for the government. I knew about technology because my mom was a software engineer, but
Will's mom is incredible. She's learned Cobalt coding language and taught it to a bunch of people there. She's a pioneer in Gabon, so it's pretty amazing.
People get paid digitally in Gabon thanks to her. Yes, she built the rails for payroll. She didn't get paid for it, but she did build it. So that was
Government jobs.
Yes, government jobs, exactly. But I didn't understand the concept of. So back then I thought MD PhD because I wanted to go back, open a bunch of clinics throughout Africa, do research because we have diseases like malaria. There's a lot around some autoimmune, AIDS and so forth, where there are just some crises happening. And well, these days, I guess pandemics happen in the U.S. too. But Ebola, bouts of Ebola and so forth. And so I thought, hey, we actually need some homegrown research and so forth. And so I was going to do an MD PhD. But then when I learned about finance, what was fascinating to me is, look, if you were to do an MD PhD, ultimately, and this was my thinking, my 22-year-old thinking or whatever, or 21-year-old, but my thinking was, if you do an MD PhD, the clinics, as is true in Gabon, the only people that can go to the clinics are the rich people. Like my mom, I have to fly her to the US and get her to a doctor in the US because somehow that ends up being better than her just trying to go to a doctor in Gabon. And so you quickly realize, okay, if I do these clinics and if I do all this, I don't know that I'm changing some lives, and of course, hopefully you're saving some lives, but most likely the people who are actually benefiting are still the same kind of upper class who actually can afford that access to medicine. And with finance, because I did this private equity case competition, it was the first time that I learned, hey, you can actually go somewhere, invest in a bunch of companies, help those companies grow, and somehow in doing that, you can create jobs, you can have all kinds of things happen as a result. And I thought, whoa, in my country, the only investor is the government. Like I didn't know how that worked. And so I became really fascinated, ended up I actually started, I don't know if it still exists, but I started like the Impact Investing Club at BYU, and that ended up becoming part of back then it was the Ballard Center for Social Entrepreneurship. We were kind of all starting all that. All at the same time, and I did the first impact investing competition. So I really went into impact investing. And so when I go into investment banking, I'm thinking I'm going to be this impact investor and impact investing, is investing in companies for profit, but also wanting a social return at the same time as you get a financial return. That was the whole idea. And so I thought I was going to go throughout Africa and do a bunch of impact investing and invest in all these social entrepreneurs who want to be dictated by the demands of capitalism in terms of making sure that you're putting out the best product and getting the best out of every product that you get, but also want a social return in whatever society they're involved in, which to me was kind of a path to improving the economic outcomes in Africa and also creating jobs in the meantime and so forth. So that's when I fall in love with finance and decide 3.5 years into my college journey that I'm going to tack on another 1.5 years and do another degree in finance.
Amazing. So from there, we'll do a little fast forward here. So then you do the finance program. Mm-hmm. You're one of the top in your class. You go to Goldman Sachs. You do investment banking there for 4 years.
3, yes.
3 years. Staying up all night on how many nights a week?
I can't remember, but yes, basically not sleeping. Yes, that's.
And Will still does that on occasion, where he emails me at 2 a.m. and I'm like, "What are you doing?" And he doesn't sleep much. So you do that. Then you go to Warburg Pincus, one of the top private equity funds in the world. You do another stint at Highland.
Incredible experience, yeah.
Yep. And then you go to business school, Harvard Business School. So you do the stint in finance. And then you kind of come back around to starting Toolbox. I want to tie this back to Toolbox.
Yeah.
Like, where does Toolbox come into this?
Okay. I keep wanting to give you short answers, but I keep realizing I actually have to explain the background of some of these decisions because it does seem very random. And frankly, when I go to business school, so I'm at Warburg, which was, again, Goldman, Warburg, both incredible places. If I weren't an entrepreneur, I would be happy to go back to either of those places in a heartbeat. Had still have amazing friends that are there and so forth. But I would say when I'm going to business school, the thought is when I come back, I'm either going to back to some kind of investing, growth equity, private equity, but covering Africa, or I'm going to impact investing finally, right? Which is what I'd been wanting to do for so many years. And so that was the thought. So when I'm getting ready to go to business school, I have very few other thoughts but to figure out how to get into an investing job in Africa, which I did end up having the opportunity towards the end of business school and walked away from, which was a good choice. But with Toolbox, as I'm in business school, a few things happen. The first thing is I'm talking to a lot of investors that are covering Africa. I find that a lot of them, you have one of two things. Either they can't find enough companies to invest in because you don't have a lot of entrepreneurs, or they do, but all of the funds come into the continent and then leave the continent, right? The LPs are in America. When they invest, they do it through special purpose vehicles that stay in like Bermuda or something, invest, and then all the cash comes out. And so you'd never actually see any sort of economic growth. But then I also start realizing I meet folks like E, who's founder of a couple of unicorns in Africa, and Della and Flutterwave. I meet GB, who's the current CEO of Flutterwave. And so I start meeting these entrepreneurs from Africa thanks to the Africa Business Club, and I'm realizing, they're actually making change, right? Like the investors are coming in and out, flying in on their private jets, coming out, but the entrepreneurs are actually making real change. They're hiring, they're training engineers, hiring engineers, helping those engineers start new companies, and there's a real ecosystem being built in places like Lagos and Accra and so forth. So I really start falling in love with that, and then I read Peter Thiel's 0 to 1, and that totally just shifts my mindset in the way that I thought about where I'm spending my time and the way that I'm becoming deterministically optimistic about the future. So not just saying, hey, I'm going to invest in a bunch of people who are creating the future, but I actually want to create that future. And that's when I decide to become an entrepreneur. And so the story of Toolbox specifically, now to answer your actual question.
Maybe I can just
yes,
stop right before you go into that. I think it's easy to take big risks when you're early in your career and you don't have big salaries and much to lose, and you're not at the most prestigious private equity firm. Like so many people, the social proof of that alone would be like, I'm going to go from that to being a founder, and go from incredible salaries to some ramen salaries when you have 5 kids. Like, how did you make that? Like, what enabled you to take that risk for you, your family? Like that's no joke.
So I think I tend to be fairly naive, and I think I've married someone who also chooses to be naive, and so I think there was just a lot of naivete behind that decision. Meaning, not that we didn't realize the sacrifice, but I think there was just a thought that, hey, look, money is just not that important, and we can just figure it out, which is a very naive way to think, because having most people who have 5 kids would tell you, actually, money can help you a lot. But yeah, I think we were just naive, and I think we also, she grew up with a ton of siblings. I grew up, not to go into too much, but eating lunch on the floor with my mom, and so to me, it's like, hey, not a big deal, and frankly, I kind of like the idea of my kids not. When we were in New York, at some point they were at, private preschool, and I kind of like the idea of them going to the public school. That feels actually better for me than feeling like I'm paying more than my university tuition on some preschool. That feels better to me, personally. So
I'm just starting to get there. Okay, so you make this decision to go at Toolbox. Maybe what would be helpful, I remember when we were at business school together, I was a year after Wil, and Wil was obsessed. Wil was so obsessed with Toolbox and this idea of helping blue-collar workers that he would sit in the back of class and just all he would do was focus on starting the company, and everybody else in business school was like, this is a period to take a break. We're going to go travel. We're going to have fun. And like we would have these like dessert nights with friends, and Will would never show up, and his wife would show up, and we'd be like, "Where's Will at?" And he was never there because he was working on his company. Maybe, and then I remember you talking about like that you were actually out in Boston on the streets talking to contractors there, figuring out what was happening. So maybe like walk us through, because he won some awards, but walk us through the like aha moment when you were out talking to people.
Yeah, and I think I only, at least this is what I tell my wife, I only did that because I felt like it was game time decision, right? Meaning I'd been playing around with the idea, and I tested a bunch of different ideas in business school. But at this point, by the time you joined us, it was getting to November of my second year. I had 6 months left or 7 months left. So I thought, hey, if I'm going to do this, I really have to figure out if I'm good at this. Like, I don't know, maybe I'm terrible at this. I don't actually know if I'm good at this, but I have to at least figure out what I'm doing, because going back into investing, I know what that looks like. And as far as I can tell, I was pretty good at it. So I could go back and do that. But I don't know what it's like to be an entrepreneur. And frankly, I was learning very basic things, like how do you talk to a user? How do you, just very basic things. And so to me, I felt like I had to put some time into it before I would decide to walk away from anything else. I needed to figure that out. And I also latched on to the original, today Toolbox is a fintech platform, but when we started, in fact, we were more focused on the labor side of things. And the reason why I locked onto that is because when I first came to the US, as I mentioned, I did work in order to pay for college. And I remember going door to door and just trying to find a blue collar job because I just needed to make money for school. And I then ran into, so business school, I ran into a couple of construction workers who are out there trying to find a job. And of course, the moment I see that, I'm like, hey, that used to be me. I remember doing that and going out and trying to find work. And so I decided to start with that because I felt like, okay, it's going to be really hard, but I care so much about this population that I feel like however hard it gets, I'm going to be able to stick with it, and I'm going to be able to keep building. And then I was spending the time to figure out, okay, let me see if I can truly do this. Instead of traveling and just deciding on a whim when I graduate to go do this, I'm going to go out there and actually take the plunge, because I've done parts of it. And to your point, by the time I graduate, I've done enough test proofing that I was able to win some of those awards. But it really came from a place of, hey, it's not that I'm trying to not take a break, but if I'm going to make this big decision in my life, I need to put in the time to make sure I'm actually making a decision that I know what it looks like on the other side.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's a pretty incredible journey to that point. And we think about, so Toolbox, I realized that we sort of buried the lead here and we never told you what Toolbox is. So Toolbox, when the first pitch came around, it was a labor marketplace. And I remember Will, describe the problem they were solving as you go on Saturday to Home Depot or Lowe's and you see that there's a bunch of workers that are in the parking lot still trying to match with labor, labor trying to match with jobs. And so originally they were solving that. They made a pivot to really becoming a financial operating system for blue collar workers.
Or rather for SMBs that, blue collar SMBs.
I should let you pitch it, not me. But.
No, here. So actually, I'll walk through the journey of how we get to where we are. So we start with the blue-collar worker, right? And we're building the labor marketplace. We decide to start building some financial tools inside of it because, of course, you need to pay the workers. And then because we're in construction, a lot of the jobs are labor and, you have labor and materials. And so we started getting involved in helping on the invoicing side for the materials. And as we saw that, being in construction, happy to walk through some of the reasons why we decided not to scale the marketplace, because as you know, when you invested, at that point we were growing some 30% week on week. It was fairly, and we were going through Y Combinator at the time, so it was really fast growth, but we just saw a lot of really bad inefficiencies as we were scaling. But we had started building on the financial side, and so eventually we decided, hey, let's focus there. And while we'll still have ambitions for the actual worker, we're starting on the company side, building the financial tooling on that side, and then with what we're building, it will naturally get us back to the worker eventually.
Yeah. Maybe on the pivot. So a lot of times we talk about startups, we tell the success stories when they stumble into product market fit. And yeah, I remember when you pitched us, it was one of the quickest decisions that Kickstart's ever made. We told you we wanted in on the round on the first pitch, and the growth was incredible. You know, somebody recently said to me that when they're talking about investor Sequoia, they said, why is Sequoia the best investor? And they said it's because they get to the truth the fastest. And I think that could be said of entrepreneurs. So when you're growing like that, 30% week over week, the platform looks to be working. Like, what? I know there's all sorts of business reasons why you were able to say to find the truth there and say like this isn't sustainable. Like, looking back now, when you think about as an entrepreneur, you mentioned earlier that like you're deterministically optimistic,
Yeah.
and by definition, as a founder, you have to have. You know, we've used all sorts of different terminology, whether it's Steve Jobs, this force field, essentially. Like you have to have this optimism. But how did you go to see the truth and say, like, I'm actually going to pivot and I'm going to start running tests even before I decide with my investors, my team, because I think this is the right decision. Like most people would wait until that curve comes down and then do it. You know, most people wait to change their employee numbers until all of a sudden, like, they have 6 months runway left. Like you started making that change early.
Yeah. It's, I don't know if there's a right decision, to be honest, because I don't know if there is a right decision, and that's where you have to go with your gut as a founder, because when we started the labor marketplace, most meetings, I had to explain what a labor marketplace is, right? That was, the first question was like, what's the labor marketplace? And I'm like, okay, well, here's what we're doing. But of course, by the time we were pivoting, Workrise, who was also, had raised at a $3 billion valuation, NERSA had raised a bunch of money, Intelligent Health or something like that had raised a bunch of money. There were all these labor marketplaces that had popped up and that were raising hundreds of millions and so forth. And so to say that you're pivoting is like, well, are you crazy? All these labor marketplaces are raising so much money. You should just keep going and do the same. Although I will say maybe one good thing is any labor marketplace that was built in the construction space has since pivoted or shut down, or is still around but seems to have mostly flatlined. And the one that had raised at a $3 billion valuation exited the construction industry altogether and just focused on the energy space. And I think a lot of what they all saw is what we saw maybe a little bit earlier, which is just there are some specific structural inefficiencies that we could feel as we were scaling. It was very obvious that priming, because once you prime a marketplace, it should start showing signs of your contribution margin going up with scale. This was the opposite. Yeah. And so when you're seeing those things, you're realizing, okay, I could keep going, but really what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep raising tens and hundreds of millions just to keep this thing going, not for my employees, but actually because my margin is not quite there as I'm scaling because of some structural efficiencies, and I'm happy to walk through those.
Back in the day of 2020 and 2021 when contribution margin...
No one cared.
Nobody said that term.
And actually, to your point, when I go out and I say I'm pivoting, people are like, what are you talking about? And I start having this conversation. Only a few investors were like, okay, I see what you mean. The others were like, you're totally insane. But yes, to your point, a year later, they're like, oh, okay, yeah, good call, right? Because if you had kept going, you would have been trying to raise a Series B, and no one would have given you money because your contribution margin wasn't there. And so it would have felt good to raise a Series A and this and that and gone out there. But I think the benefit of, and maybe to your point earlier, the benefit of having been at places like Goldman and Warburg is I'm not an entrepreneur because I want to be on the cover of something, raising some money. And so as a result, even if I feel like, okay, there's a path to raising this much money, if I don't feel like the economics make sense, I'm just going to say, look, we're building a business that's going to be upside down, and that doesn't make sense. Let's actually build a real business. And so that's when I finally made the call. And of course, we had other things going on. PPP loans were happening at the time. And so a lot of our big customers needed to take people in-house so they could get the loans forgiven. So there were lots of other structural things going on that were also showing up as short-term challenges. But we knew we could ride those. What we couldn't ride was our economics being not as good as they needed to have been.
Yeah. I'm going to do a little time check here, see where we're at. Okay, we'll do a few more minutes here, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So maybe the last point that, this is still an act two. This is a story that's very much developing, both from a personal and from a Toolbox perspective. You've raised about $10 million to date. Maybe what have you learned in fundraising, both from you had all the hot signals of YC and whatnot in the first round, and then you did a pivot, and pivots can often be hard to fundraise into. Maybe tell us a little bit, what's your advice? What have you learned from fundraising?
Yeah, and then proceeded to raise more after the pivot, despite what we had just done. No, I would say, the first thing is, as a founder, and I say this knowing that I don't do this all the time, by the way, but as a founder, you really have to trust your gut. If it's obvious to you that there's something not right, it probably is not right, and you should trust that gut. I would say the second thing is, especially in 2024, focus on the fundamentals. It doesn't matter what you're building. I'm building this for this segment, and this is what they were using before. This is how much they were paying for it before, and this is what I'm giving them that they weren't getting from the previous product. And so if I give them this is the value to the user, and that's what I'm able to do. And you don't have to get complex about it, by the way. This is not I'm not saying you have to build some crazy model. You just have to talk to the user. And we were talking to a user, there's a feature that we're testing, and we're talking to a user, and he just came back and he said, well, actually, if you solve this for me, this is something that currently costs me $5,000 a month. So you could figure out what your pricing is. No, he's not going to pay us $5,000 a month for it. I wish he could, but it's probably above $500 a month that he would pay us for that, because that's how much he's paying for something like that. And so it's not about anything complex as much as talk to your user, really listen to what they're saying in terms of what's the pain, what are they trying to solve, where are they trying to get to with their business. If that's on the business side, on the consumer side, of course, there is likely something you're replacing for a consumer. And once you understand that, and this is maybe the one part that I would do better at, is pounce on it as quickly as humanly possible and just keep hammering at that. And I would feel like that's the part where I was a little bit gun shy in the past. Even after that pivot, I think I still spent a lot of time just trying to get confirmation. I would say once you feel that from enough people, just pounce on it so quickly and just move as fast as humanly possible to capture that kind of value, because if you do, then you'll be able to grow from there. And even if you don't know what the full platform looks like, if you know what the feature looks like and you know someone really wants that feature and there's no way they can get that feature today, build it, and then you could figure out the rest of the big platform later. And that's one thing that I did wrong, is I always wanted to figure out what the big platform looked like before I made the jump, and sometimes wasted some months doing that.
Yeah, and I would say one thing that I've been impressed working on the board and working with you on this is you've always come to us with your concerns before we needed to bring them up, and made the decisions prior to us saying, a lot of times we have meetings and it's clear that the business is burning too hot. They're going to need to cut down their costs. They're going to need to pivot. Something's going to need to happen, and often it's a exercise in trying to help put that information forward and facilitate a change with companies. And you made those changes, I would say, to your credit, on many areas very quickly, and I think that showed that you're willing. There's obviously a trade-off between maintaining the mission, maintaining the focus, beating the drum. We often say selling what's on the truck, as well as updating your priors, being willing to change and adapt. And so I think you've done that very well. Maybe my last question, I know, then we'll open it up with what are you excited about for Toolbox going forward? As you think about the vision.
Yeah, I would say, so I talked last night, I I guess call it a coffee meeting, but I don't know what you call it in Utah. It was over Zoom with another founder, and she is building in biotech. So they're very impressive kind of biotechnology in terms of early screening of embryos to figure out what potential diseases a child may have. And we were talking about how it's so much easier for her to see the impact in what she's building, right? You can quickly see, hey, if I figure this out and I am able to scale it, I will save millions of embryos across the world. Of course.
Yeah.
Super, right? Very easy to figure out what your focus is. I would say for us, I feel like we are finally figuring out what to build so that we can help businesses not go out of business, right? Because I think many people don't realize, right, SMBs, which is where we work, the reason why SMBs can't hire as much, can't pay people as well, most of them go out of business because there are a lot of fundamental things around the tooling that they're using. They just don't have visibility into their business. And I feel like we finally are getting to that kernel of truth of what could we build to give you that visibility so that your business can not lose money, can not go out of business, so that you don't end up on, I don't want to say any names, but you don't end up on some sketchy lending website, which most of them do, where you're paying 50% interest on a loan because you needed cash last minute and you needed to put that cash in the business, and now all your profits and all of your employee pay is basically going to some lender, and we're finally getting to that. And to me, that's when I'm starting to see the real impact, right? Beyond, because we have corporate cards, deposit accounts payable, and of course it's great. You see the volume, it's fantastic, but how is the business actually going to change as a result? And I feel like we're finally getting to it and figuring out how we're going to implement that in a way to give those businesses the visibility they need to keep more of their cash and hopefully not end up paying 50% interest on a loan somewhere.
That's amazing, and that ties back to one of your decision points early on, which is creating economic growth for
Absolutely.
individuals, small businesses. Great, let's open it up.
You briefly mentioned Y Combinator. Can you tell us more about your experience with Y Combinator? You're applying the value you got out of it.
I love YC. I have a lot of WhatsApp groups that I'm a part of, and the most active ones are Africa related or YC folks. And so in many ways, I feel like I'm still in YC. And there are a lot of fintechs, and we have a fintech group where, especially with what's happening today in fintech, for those of you who don't know, there's lots of banks supporting fintechs, regulators have been sending them consent orders. There's all kinds of upheaval happening. And I feel like my ears are to the ground because I have all those founders there. We're all going through the same thing, and they're able to give us a lot of great insight. So YC is still continuing. So the value there for me is massive, absolutely immense. I would say in terms of the application, like me going to community college, I feel like it was very much, this was 2020, and we were building a labor marketplace. We started growing, and we were building a labor marketplace in New York City, and of course, the whole city shuts down. And then the marketplace is starting to come back up, and we're realizing, hey, as we start scaling, we're going to need to raise money. And we talked to a few VCs, and a bunch of VCs basically said, right now, we're not giving money to anyone unless they have someone behind them, like YC or some other, because this was the early part of the pandemic when people thought the world was just ending. So they were not funding any startups except for YC startups. And so my co-founder and I just decided, hey, maybe we should apply to YC. And so I was actually...
We would have funded you without YC.
Well, thank you. This is going to sound horrible, but I was actually on vacation, and we went on a hike, and I came back from the hike and was like, I'm going to apply to YC. And it was in St. George, and thankfully we were with friends, and we rented this house, and so everyone was at the pool, and I just went up to the bedroom, and I just cranked out a YC application, did the video, everything, and sent it all, and then went back to the vacation that night. And then on Tuesday, we heard from YC and then went through the interview. But ultimately, so it was a very last minute thing, but I'm so grateful we did it because it's really made a big difference. And I do help folks who are applying to YC. So if you know founders who are applying to YC, please reach out to me on LinkedIn. I've recommended quite a few startups that I've gotten into YC, and so I'm more than happy to do that anytime.
Would you do it again if you did a different startup? Just quick answers.
Yeah. Depending on my co-founders, because I'm already in the community.
Yeah.
But I would still love to do it, but I feel like if my co-founders haven't done it, then I'll definitely do it again.
Interesting.
So it sounds like your company was growing during COVID. I'm curious, how many employees do you have now, and what's your thoughts about remote work versus in office?
Yeah. We are about a dozen today. And on the thought about remote work, that does include about 4 people in Africa, engineers. And so, yes, of course, I am more pro-remote. I would say it's context-specific for me, and it's also role-specific. So we had, I would say, sales, probably want that in person, in an office. I feel like there's so much that you get from sales in an office. Engineering, probably don't need your whole engineering team to be in one room all the time. You probably want to be in person with some key engineering leaders, but you don't need your whole engineering team to be there. I think there are fantastic tools today between, there are fantastic co-pilot tools, fantastic project management tools on the engineering side. I don't think you need your whole engineering team in one room as you scale. And so I would say context-specific, but also role-specific, and it really depends on how much energy you get from being in person. Engineers hate being in person, from what I can tell, when they're trying to push out a bunch of code, and so probably doesn't make as much sense for them.
So you spoke to this a little bit, but I'm really interested in the time period where you pivoted and the courage that it kind of takes to face a fundraising market that is so focused on top line, kind of putting profits aside, right? And what were you doing, or what were you looking at? What were the types of things that led you to, in that environment, really make that decision and go that route?
Yeah. One thing that I learned the hard way with pivoting is the first decision you have to make is to stop what you're doing, right? You shouldn't make a decision to start something new until you've gotten comfortable with stopping what you're already doing. And I think in some ways I didn't fully understand that, but you have to say, am I comfortable today getting rid of my whole team and starting over from scratch? I don't think I understood that, but I have since understood the need to do that. And so you first need to be comfortable with saying, I'm going to stop what I'm doing because I've found something so fundamentally wrong with what I'm doing that I'm willing to stop it. If you're not willing to do that, you probably shouldn't pivot. You should just keep going. And maybe you should take a vacation or do something else because you're burnt out. But if you're not willing to stop what you're doing, then I wouldn't just go ahead and pivot. Once you've made that decision to stop, then the next decision is, well, am I going to shut down my whole company? Is there something where, with my current customers, there's still something that makes sense? That's what we found, and that's why when you look at us today, we are going after SMBs that are not in construction, but we started with our financial platform just with construction because we knew that our customers wanted the new platform, right? And so there was, and that's why we were keeping one side of our marketplace, the business, the demand side of our marketplace, and we were building additional tooling for them and additional products for them. And so it was truly, the pivoting on one foot, right? We weren't taking both feet and just jumping into something completely different. We were keeping in touch with the same customer base, but just building something different for them. And the reason why we're able to fundraise about 6 months after the pivot was because we then saw very good growth on the pivot. I believe when we did the fundraise, and then the year after, we were seeing 10x growth. And so we were able to see that also because we already understood the market well enough that once we knew what we needed to build, once we started building that, we got a really good early growth to then go raise an additional round of funding and see that through. So I would say that to me is the key thing is you know what you're you have a very good thought of what you're building next, and you're willing to burn the boats and start over. I think I bored them sufficiently.
Yeah. Well, awesome. We good? Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? Well, yeah. Thanks for coming, everyone. I think as you can see, Will's a special entrepreneur, and we're really excited that he's in Silicon Slopes. That we got him here from New York. I don't know, had COVID not happened, I don't know that you would be here, and so we're excited about what he's building.
Utah is an amazing place. I'm excited to be here, truly.